Opening the center allows for swift development of pieces and immediate influence over key squares. Inviting sharp positional battles, this Sicilian defense immediately stakes a claim on the d4 square and prepares for an active queenside initiative. Nurturing central control and preparing queenside castling, this knight's sortie ignites the Sicilian skirmish's dynamic potential. Solidifying the pawn chain, this move prepares for central skirmishes and opens lines for the bishop. Securing the e4 pawn's advance and preparing a kingside development, this move prioritizes flexibility over immediate aggression. Developing a piece to its natural square, this knight now supports central pawns and prepares for further piece activity. Developing the knight to a more passive square like d2, this sidestep sacrifices immediate central pressure for a flexible buildup, potentially preparing a queenside expansion or a subtle maneuvering game. Developing knights early is often sound, but this one opens lines that could prove hazardous to your monarch later. Solidifying the kingside, g3 prepares a fianchetto, aiming for long-term pawn structure and control of the long diagonal. Opening up lines for the queen and bishop while solidifying the pawn structure, this prepares a fight for central squares. Unlocking the kingside fianchetto, this bishop now surveys the longest diagonal, poised to support the d4 pawn thrust or exert pressure on black's queenside if the opportunity arises. Developing the bishop to a stable outpost prepares for castling and bolsters the pawn chain's defensive integrity, a prudent step in this evolving Sicilian structure. Finally securing the king's safety, white prepares for a more aggressive central pawn push or a flank attack, while simultaneously enabling the rook to join the action along the open files. Securely tucking the monarch away heralds a commitment to positional play, preparing to develop the queenside and solidify the pawn structure for the middle game's inevitable confrontations. Fortifying the center and preparing a queenside pawn expansion, this move elegantly supports the d4 push, aiming to gain more breathing room and restrict black's pieces. Breaking open the center now is a bold declaration, aiming to disrupt white's solid setup and exploit the slightly uncoordinated pieces. It's a race to seize central space and create attacking chances before white can fully mobilize their queenside. Positioning the rook on the e-file aims to support a potential e4-e5 pawn push, seeking to unravel black's solid central pawn chain and create attacking chances on the kingside. The queen now aims for a more active central presence, potentially eyeing squares like c2 or even preparing a flank advance down the queenside. It's a subtle but purposeful repositioning. The knight's redeployment to f1, a seemingly passive retreat, is a clever repositioning to support a potential kingside pawn storm or to prepare a diagonal thrust for the bishop on g2. It's a move designed to offer more flexibility, potentially transposing into quieter positional struggles while keeping attacking options fluid. Placing the bishop on d7 supports the central pawn push, preparing to challenge white's control of the d-file and potentially liberating the queenside. Opening up the center with this pawn thrust immediately constricts black's pieces, particularly the light-squared bishop, and creates new dynamic possibilities on the kingside, though it also potentially weakens white's own pawn structure if not carefully supported. The knight strategically repositions, preparing to reinforce the kingside pawn structure and potentially redeploy to the g7 square, anchoring a flexible defense against white's advancing e5 pawn, while also keeping an eye on the central complexities that white's somewhat passive development has fostered. The bishop now pivots to the wing, ready to support potential queenside expansion while simultaneously eyeing the potentially vulnerable d6 pawn. Initiating an immediate counterattack against white's central pawn push, this aggressive placement of the queen on the queenside directly challenges the advanced e5 pawn and opens up potential lines of assault. Black is skillfully leveraging the semi-open queenside files, seeking to exploit the slight awkwardness of white's knights and the potentially exposed kingside. This maneuver forces white to make a decision about how to defend their central structure, potentially leading to a dynamic struggle where piece activity and central control will be paramount. Preparing to launch a pawn storm on the king side, white repositions the queen to support the advanced g-pawn and potentially facilitate an eventual f4 advance, aiming to restrict black's bishop on d7 and gain more central space. Rerouting the bishop back to d8, black seeks to untangle their pieces and potentially support a central pawn push or prepare for a kingside maneuver, acknowledging the cramped space created by white's e5 advance. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside, white aims to pry open black's defenses, potentially targeting the weakened kingside pawns and the uncastled king. The queen's relocation to the queenside, a6, aims to exploit the queenside pawn structure and potentially pressure white's c3 pawn, although it leaves the queen somewhat exposed and removes it from central defensive duties, opening up possibilities for white to develop aggressive attacking lines on the kingside where black's king currently resides. Intensifying the kingside pressure, white boldly pushes the pawn, aiming to pry open lines and expose black's monarch. Black's knight establishes a defensive outpost on the 7th rank, reinforcing the kingside and preparing for a potential counterthrust. Pushing that pawn forward aggressively opens a pathway towards black's kingside, creating a daring attempt to unravel its defenses before the center is fully settled. This pawn storm, while potentially decisive, also risks overextending and leaving its own king exposed should black find a way to counterattack effectively. Fortifying the kingside pawn structure, g6 aims to create a protective wall against white's advancing pieces, but it permanently weakens the dark squares around black's monarch, potentially inviting future attacks along the h-file or diagonals. The bishop ventures forth, eyeing the kingside and challenging black's pawn structure, aiming to pry open lines for white's offensive pieces and perhaps create weaknesses around the black king, a bold declaration of intent to destabilize the opponent's carefully constructed defensive setup. A strategic masterstroke aiming to activate the slumbering rook and challenge white's dominant kingside pawns. This maneuver signals an intent to contest the semi-open c-file, a crucial artery for maneuvering black's forces. The rook's relocation from c8 to c8, while seemingly minor, represents a significant shift in positional priorities, preparing for potential pawn breaks or exchanges along the 3rd rank. It also cleverly avoids the direct confrontation with the g-pawn, which white seems eager to push further up the board. Black is implicitly saying, while you build your attack, I'm busy fortifying my position and seeking counterplay elsewhere. This measured approach contrasts sharply with white's aggressive pawn storm, suggesting a patient and potentially more robust defensive structure. The queen's repositioning to a6 earlier was a clever precursor, creating the diagonal path for this rook shuffle. Now, that pressure can be more directly translated onto the c-file. The knight embarks on a circuitous route, aiming for greater influence on the kingside, a bold repositioning that sacrifices immediate central control for potential long-term attacking opportunities. The bishop's retreat to b5 aims to disrupt white's queenside harmony, potentially forcing concessions or creating tactical opportunities. Black eyes the c3 pawn and might be looking to exchange the bishop for a knight, which could activate the rook on c8 along the now open c-file. This move, while seemingly passive, creates a dynamic tension, forcing white to carefully consider the consequences of their attacking setup on the kingside. It's a subtle probing maneuver, testing white's resolve and readiness to defend. Shifting the bishop back to f1, a retreat that may seem passive, actually aims to consolidate white's central presence and prepare for a potential repositioning of the piece to a more active square on the kingside, perhaps g2 again, or even a3 if the opportunity arises to disrupt black's queenside structure. This maneuver also frees up the g1 square, a potential resting place for the knight if it needs to retreat from the h-file skirmish. Instilling a dynamic outpost on the 5th rank, this knight boldly sacrifices its initial comfort zone, aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn phalanx and create opportunities for black's queenside counterplay. Its presence there eyes potential weaknesses and prepares for a possible pawn storm or piece infiltration down the d and e files, forcing white to acknowledge this new threat. Diving deep into the heart of black's camp, this knight maneuver directly targets the weakened dark squares around the king, posing an immediate threat to the fragile pawn shield and initiating a forceful assault. The queen's repositioning to b6, while seemingly defensive, invites further pawn advancement on the kingside and potentially sacrifices control of the d5 square, allowing white's knight to establish a strong outpost. Seeking to untangle its queen and reposition it for an assault on the king's side, white endeavors to create more dynamic possibilities. This maneuver is a bold attempt to establish a positional foothold on the queen side, aiming to free the bishop on c8 and potentially create attacking opportunities by challenging white's advanced pawn structure. Disrupting black's bishop outpost, this capture clears a path for the knight, aiming to reroute it to more active squares. Reclaiming the queen from its compromised outpost initiates a crucial positional tug-of-war, as black seeks to redeploy its monarch while white endeavors to maintain pressure on the kingside. Breaking open the center with d4 aggressively challenges black's pawn chain, aiming to exploit any weaknesses that might arise from black's somewhat passive development, particularly the isolated queen's pawn on d6, which will soon become a target. Black solidifies the pawn structure, preparing to reroute the knight. Sculpting a menacing outpost on d3 for the bishop, this move aims to disrupt black's central stability and prepare for a potential kingside assault by indirectly supporting the knight on g4 and eyeing the vulnerable black king. Shifting the king to the corner on h8 is a prudent defensive maneuver, subtly preparing to shelter it from any potential threats along the newly opened g-file or the diagonal that black's bishop on d8 might influence. Securing the monarch's escape route is paramount. This king's repositioning subtly prepares for a potential pawn storm or defensive repositioning, acknowledging the looming threats across the board and seeking a more robust sanctuary from the open files. Bringing the rook to the 7th rank, a bold maneuver aiming to disrupt white's pawn chain and potentially establish a strong outpost, hinting at a potential shift towards a more active endgame scenario where those doubled pawns might become a weakness. Gaining breathing room for the queenside pieces. Attempting to solidify the pawn chain, black concedes significant queenside space, opening avenues for white's rooks and potentially weakening the c4 pawn support structure in the long run. Reorganizing the bishop's diagonal presence, a pivot from c2 aims to reignite pressure on the queenside pawn chain and potentially challenge the opponent's compact formation, rather than passively waiting for a breakthrough on the kingside. Consolidating the queen's position here, even on an otherwise passive square, signifies a defensive posture, a prelude to potential regrouping as white's pieces begin to exert pressure on the kingside. Targeting the weak kingside pawns becomes paramount, and this queen redeployment, *QG5*, aims directly at that vulnerable sector by offering immediate pressure. With an exchange of queens, black opts to simplify the position, trading off the most powerful pieces and potentially steering the game towards an endgame where their slightly less active king might become a factor. The knight's relocation opens up new avenues for attack, transforming a potentially stagnant center into a dynamic battlefield where pieces can maneuver with greater freedom and initiative. A thoughtful repositioning aims to bring the knight to a more active square, perhaps to defend against potential pawn advances or to seek out new attacking avenues. The knight repositions to a square that offers greater central influence and supports potential pawn advances on the kingside, aiming to consolidate white's already significant space advantage. Initiating a bold regrouping sequence, the knight embarks on a circuitous journey, aiming to secure its presence on a more strategically relevant square. This maneuver prioritizes piece activity and pawn structure rehabilitation over immediate territorial gains, acknowledging the opponent's established central control and potential kingside initiative. The long-term objective appears to be reinforcing the kingside defense or preparing a counterthrust on the queenside, depending on white's subsequent actions. The rook suddenly shifts, a bold repositioning aiming to seize the open file and establish a crucial presence on the 3rd rank, potentially creating future attacking avenues or defending key squares. The knight's retreat to e7 initiates a repositioning, potentially aiming to shore up the kingside or prepare for a more active role in the center. Black is attempting to find a more harmonious placement for their pieces after white's sustained kingside pawn advance. This maneuver signifies a strategic reallocation of resources, acknowledging the current positional realities and seeking to adapt. Exploiting the exposed king's weakened diagonal after sacrificing the bishop, White initiates a dangerous pawn storm aimed at cracking open Black's defenses. Unleashing the pawn storm on the king's side, though seemingly aggressive, tragically rips open the king's shelter, creating immediate and perhaps insurmountable weaknesses for the Black monarch with the subsequent king walk. Sacrificing the pawn here opens the h-file with decisive intent, aiming to unravel Black's king and initiate a swift mating attack on the weakened kingside before Black can organize effective counterplay. Gambiting material like this, forcing a pawn to advance, seems a desperate attempt to liberate the kingside and create escape routes, though it leaves the monarch dangerously exposed. Unleashing the rook down the open file to solidify control and eye the weakened Black king. A desperate attempt to block the unstoppable king hunt, but it overlooks the exposed kingside and the looming knight fork potential that Black now has. Sacrificing the knight opens a critical path for the rook and queen, forcing Black to confront an immediate material deficit and a compromised pawn structure around their king. With the recapture, Black reestablishes a pawn chain and aims to solidify their position, though the king now looks a touch more exposed with the open h-file. The pawn captures, ripping open the king's defense and creating a passed pawn that will become a major threat, demanding immediate attention and disrupting Black's previously stable structure. Now the rook emerges from its defensive shell, aiming to exploit the momentarily exposed g-file and challenge the opponent's central pawn structure. Reviving the open file for the rook is crucial, but the king's exposed position after the pawn sacrifice remains a significant concern that needs constant vigilance. Emerging from a tense defensive posture, Black's rook repositions to a more active central file, seeking to contest the open e-file and offer crucial support to its beleaguered king, a subtle yet vital regrouping in the face of White's exposed pawn thrust. Unleashing a pawn to spear the d-file, this piece initiates a vital offensive thrust, aiming to disrupt Black's rook's control and pry open lines toward the enemy monarch, while simultaneously reinforcing White's own central presence. Repositioning the bishop to d7 aims to reinforce the kingside pawn structure, particularly the vulnerable h-pawn, and potentially prepare for future defensive maneuvers by activating the light-squared bishop from its currently passive square on b5. The monarch ventures forth, a bold gambit towards the center, seeking to activate the king and potentially contest the open files now that the exchange has simplified the board. The Black king, now exposed on g7, becomes a primary target. This pawn push on the g-file creates significant weaknesses around the Black monarch, opening lines for White's attacking pieces and potentially leading to a swift mating attack. Boldly initiating an aggressive king hunt, White throws caution to the wind and seeks to exploit the exposed Black monarch for a quick checkmate. The bishop now occupies a passive diagonal, its influence severely limited by the pawn chain and its own pieces. Consolidating the rook to the open file and preparing to bring the king closer to the action are the core ideas behind this maneuver. Black aims to solidify his structure and prepare for a potential exchange of pieces, seeking to simplify into a more manageable endgame. Here's a breakdown of the strategic considerations. Defensive consolidation. Asterisk the rook's repositioning on the f-file is a defensive maneuver, reinforcing the pawn chain and offering support to the f6 knight if it comes under attack. It also prepares to contest the f-file should it open further. Endgame transition. Asterisk with queens off the board, the game is moving towards an endgame. Black is clearly looking to improve his rook placement, potentially eyeing exchanges that could lead to a favorable simplification. Piece coordination. Asterisk this move is part of a broader plan to coordinate Black's remaining pieces. The rook on f8 can now work in tandem with the knight on f6 and potentially the bishop on d7, creating a more cohesive defensive unit. Counterplay potential. While primarily defensive, this move also lays the groundwork for potential counterplay. By reinforcing his own position, Black creates opportunities to exploit any weaknesses White might create in his attempt to advance. Avoiding simplification. Asterisk, while exchanges are on black's mind, he's not rushing into anything. This move avoids immediate simplifications that might not be advantageous and allows for flexibility. Unleashing the king into the fray, this aggressive maneuver aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and exploit the open files created by the recent exchanges. Baffling, black voluntarily surrenders the only active defense for his beleaguered monarch, allowing white's rook to become a fearsome, unblockable spearhead aimed directly at the king's remaining sanctuary, and in doing so, seals his own doom with a premature abdication of his defensive capabilities. Reclaiming the central files is paramount now, aiming to dislodge black's entrenched rook and prepare for an assault on the weakened kingside. A surprising retreat, the rook vacates the critical 8th rank, perhaps preparing a sneaky counterattack along the 3rd, but it leaves the kingside pawn structure looking quite exposed. Activating the queenside pawn structure is the immediate goal, aiming to create a passed pawn on the queenside and disrupt black's defensive setup by creating space for your pieces. A tentative repositioning to the 8th rank, seeking to bolster the defense around the isolated king and perhaps escape the pressure on the kingside. The pawn thrust opens a crucial pathway, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create opportunities on the queenside. Unlocking the d-file is a desperate bid to create counterplay against white's dominant queenside pawn push and exposed monarch, aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed formation before it solidifies further. Activating the rook on the kingside, this initiative aims to exploit the newly opened kingside and the king's exposed position. The immediate priority is to prevent white's rook from achieving complete domination on the kingside by anchoring it on the 7th rank, which would severely restrict your pieces and potentially lead to a mating attack. Gaining kingside space is white's immediate priority, preparing to dislodge black's rook from its active post on the 7th rank. A subtle repositioning aims to fortify the queenside and potentially prepare a later advance or secure the vulnerable bishop. Unlocking the kingside pawn chain with that knight maneuver now offers the potential for a decisive breakthrough, aiming to disrupt black's defensive structure and create attacking opportunities.